Hello, everyone. Here we go. We're continuing our look at Vietnam. And this slide is called Vietnam Erodes. And erodes means, I guess in this context, goes badly. So I started talking about Vietnam last time and the fact that the United States encouraged South Vietnam to, in effect, secede, and that North Vietnam said, you will not secede, and first supported the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, and then later on invaded South Vietnam. And to the Vietnamese, this was a civil war similar to the American Civil War. But to the Americans, this was a war about communism because the North happened to believe in an economic system called communism. And that is why the U.S. supported South Vietnam. So in effect, what the U.S. is doing is saying its belief in capitalism is more important than its belief in democracy. Now, what I'm about to show you, you should look at the slides that go along with today's video because I assume it'll become clear. But what happened to make the United States to decide to withdraw from Vietnam? And this first slide is a picture of Kent State University in Ohio. And that is a student shot by the Ohio National Guard. What happened throughout college campuses in the U.S. is that college students not wanting to fight in Vietnam because they just believed, why is the U.S. there? Vietnam never attacked the U.S. Why are we there? Protested the Vietnam War, and some of those protests got a little bit out of hand. This is an example. The Kent State University campus was ordered closed. These students refused to go back to their dorms. So the National Guard went out to sort of take control of the campus, and 4 students were shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard. And this picture was taken. So if you think about the effect of the power of media, it now looks like American soldiers are shooting and killing college students for simply expressing their American right to freedom of opinion. So this doesn't look good. The next slide I'm showing you is a picture of dead old men, women, and children. You can see babies in this picture. And this is a photograph taken of the My Lai massacre. American soldiers were tasked with the requirement of finding the Viet Cong. Well, Viet Cong soldiers did not wear uniforms. How are you supposed to find Viet Cong members in South Vietnam? So an American soldier named William Calley simply came to the conclusion when he reached a small village called My Lai that he would kill everyone. And I guess that would guarantee the success of finding the Viet Cong. And so he ordered his men to shoot and kill everyone. This picture was taken afterwards, and you can again see babies, women, children. And again, this doesn't look good. This looks like now American soldiers are killing innocent civilians. So we're killing Americans who are expressing their opinion. We're killing babies. The third piece of evidence that I'm providing for you is a New York Times article about something. And the Pentagon Papers were secret documents that somehow the New York Times got a hold of and published. And the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. government knew that the Vietnam War was not going well, even though the U.S. government reported to the American public that it was going great. And so what we have here is put these things together. Americans are being shot and killed for expressing their opinion. Vietnamese civilians are being killed, and the U.S. government is lying to its own citizens. And here's a fourth picture that I have here. This is the moment when this person executed this person. And what's going on here is this is the chief of police of Saigon, and he was brought. This person was brought to him, and the police chief was told that this is a Viet Cong member. So he immediately got his gun out and shot him in the head. No trial, and this is the team we're supporting. And so put all 4 of these things together. American soldiers are shooting Americans who are expressing their opinion. American soldiers are shooting and killing babies. The U.S. government is lying to its own citizens, and the side we're supporting seems to be executioners. It just doesn't look good. This is J. Edgar Hoover, and it was revealed at this time that there was a program called COINTELPRO, where the U.S. government was spying on American citizens. Elvis was spied on, as an example. So the American government is spying on its own citizens. You put all these things together, all five of these things, and it leads to the U.S. government losing support from the American public for the Vietnam War. The last slide I'm showing you on this page, last picture, is this is Vietnam, and all these circles represent a location where the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army launched a series of attacks all in one day. That day was Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year, at the same time. How could this have happened if the American war effort in Vietnam was going so well? If we were just crushing the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, how could they possibly have done this? Was the question asked. And so in response to all this, the U.S. Congress passed something called the War Powers Act, which basically said that the president has to ask Congress for permission if American soldiers are in a foreign country longer than, I think it's 2 months. I'm not sure about that. Put all of these things together, and you have an American public pretty skeptical of the U.S. Participation in the Vietnam War, which leads to Johnson deciding not to run for re-election and the election of Richard Nixon. And so Richard Nixon basically says, look, if when I'm president, we are going to get out of Vietnam. And what we're going to do is we're going to support a program called Vietnamization. What we'll do is the American military will train the South Vietnamese Army. 1,000 soldiers are trained, we'll withdraw 1,000 American soldiers. When 10,000 South Vietnamese soldiers are trained, we'll withdraw 10,000 American soldiers. And by 1973, basically all American soldiers were out of Vietnam, with the exception of the soldier that stayed in Saigon to protect the American embassy, the one building. So that's what Vietnamization was. The United States also, during the Nixon administration, bombed this red series of lines here. It's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a trail that the North Vietnamese used to get into South Vietnam. But when you look at the slides, you can see that the Ho Chi Minh Trail goes into a country called Laos and slightly into a country called Cambodia. Well, what the U.S. government did was they bombed Laos and they bombed Cambodia. And so what we're doing is we're spreading the Vietnam War to neighboring countries. And this led to civil war in Cambodia. And in effect, the domino theory kind of came true in that communism did spread from Vietnam into Cambodia and into Laos. And so the United States is now bombing other countries. We're in Vietnam, but we're now bombing Laos and Cambodia. This wasn't necessarily popular. So by 1973, all American soldiers were out of Vietnam, and the last person that I'm introducing you is a guy by the name of Pol Pot. He was the guy that ended up taking control in Cambodia when the civil war erupted in Cambodia, which was triggered by the American bombing of Cambodia because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This guy named Pol Pot ended up taking control in Vietnam. We'll continue our talk of Vietnam soon. There are other things that Nixon did as president. This is Richard Nixon, and this is Leonid Brezhnev. He's the leader of the Soviet Union, and there they are shaking hands because they started a program of interaction with each other, the United States and the Soviet Union, called détente. And détente literally means thaw. It's a French term meaning thaw. So think about that. Cold War thaw, right? An improvement in the relationship between the two. And as an example, the United States and the Soviet Union signed something called the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This treaty reduced the number of missiles that they had against each other. Later on, they signed another treaty called SALT, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Again, another treaty that reduced the number of missiles that the United States and the Soviet Union were pointing at each other. And finally, on this slide anyway, Nixon decided to recognize China as China. That is Mao Zedong. And Nixon was the president that said, yep, you're the leader of China. And you might recall this, that before this, the United States pretended that Taiwan was China. Nixon was the one that said, no, China is China. But again, what you're looking at here is an improving of relations between the United States and countries, and improving the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and improving in the relationship between the United States and China, and our withdrawal from Vietnam. A major shift in topics here, and all of these are potential topics for your next Blue Book essay. You could question whether the decision of the Supreme Court in these cases was the right decision. So I'm just going to briefly talk about these cases. There's a case called Griswold versus Connecticut. It established that this idea that you have the right to privacy, or as I like to say, privacy. And of course, if you look at the Constitution, there is no stated right to privacy, but it's an implied right. And one thing I want you to know is this: once the Supreme Court makes a ruling where they establish a new right, or I don't know, maybe this isn't a new right, but when they say, all right, you have the right to privacy, that is as much a right as any stated right in the U.S. Constitution. Supreme Court decisions have the same weight as any amendment. So when you hear people say, there's no right to privacy, where is it in the Constitution? You can respond by saying, well, no, it isn't in the Constitution, but there was a Supreme Court decision that established this right, so you do have this right. Sorry about that. Our next case is Gideon v. Wainwright, and I'm sure you've heard of your Miranda rights. This is similar. You have the right to a lawyer. Well, what if you can't afford it? Well, if you can't afford your own lawyer, the state will pay for your lawyer. And that right was established at this time. Our third case was the Miranda case, which established your Miranda rights. Watch any police show on TV and you know your Miranda rights. It's kind of a fascinating story if you want to Google Mr. Miranda. What he did is kind of fascinating. He was found guilty of in a trial, and then he grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil and he wrote by hand to the Supreme Court saying he never had a lawyer, he was never told he didn't have to answer police questions, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Supreme Court threw his case out and he had a new trial. And so this is the trial that said you don't have to talk to the cops if you don't want to, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you can't say will be used against you in a court of law, et cetera, et cetera. And then the final case we're looking at quickly here is a case called Engel v. Vitale, also another case, Abington versus Schempp. This is the case that ended teacher-led compulsory prayer in public schools. And you could take any one of these cases and say, did the Supreme Court make the right decision? Look at the arguments from both sides, and then decide whether or not the Supreme Court made the right decision. Last note for today, and that is that as president, Nixon was president until he resigned. He got to replace 4 Supreme Court justices. And of course, Nixon, as a Republican, was more conservative. These are all fairly liberal decisions. This increases the right of government, and gives rights to victims. And all 4 of these happened because of judges that were appointed before Nixon. Nixon would appoint 4 new judges, and this would make the Supreme Court more conservative from this point onward. All right, I hope everything is going well. Please take a look at Google Classroom for your responsibilities as far as Blue Book essay, paper, and stuff like that. Have a great day.